You're listening to The Apple and Biscuit Show with Jason Nicholas and Dr. Neil Hillman.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to this edition of The Apple and Biscuit Show. I'm Dr. Neil Hillman.
And I'm Jason Nicholas.
As our regular listener will know, Jason and I are audio professionals working in the sound for moving pictures sector, and these days mainly as dialogue editors and mixers in post-production. But between us, we also have a comprehensive background in location sound recording for documentaries and current affairs, as well as production sound mixing on set for feature films, television drama and commercials.
And as well as practitioners, we have an academic interest in the topic of sound and its far-reaching implications for all of us in our day-to-day lives. Neil with his research work on how sound impacts on human emotions, and my formal background in human ecology. Hopefully this combination of practical and theoretical makes us slightly different in the approach we take to the sound work our clients engage us for. And we hope it also makes for interesting listening with the guests who join us on the show.
Today, it's our enormous pleasure to talk with one of the television industry's leading lights in television light entertainment, Jonathan Glazier. Over a 40-year career, Jonathan has directed and produced some of the world's most popular TV shows, and he has the awards to prove it, as well as the rare experience of firstly consulting to and then leading one of the BBC's most historically significant and influential departments as the editor of BBC Light Entertainment and International Formats. But Jonathan's remarkable television career started in the sound department, and that's something we'll get to as soon as I've said, Jonathan, welcome to the show. Are you well, and where in the world do we find you today?
Neil, it's so nice to speak to you, and you, Jason. I am in Cambridge, UK, at home, a bit unusually, and enjoying a kind of a slight, brief, mild autumn.
Excellent. Now, what the listener won't know is that we share a little bit of our backstories, don't we? Because we both started our television careers at the historic Elstree studios in the sound department. You a little bit before me in 1979 when the studios were owned by ATV. And I joined just after ATV's commercial television broadcast licence had been taken over by Central Television. That was in 1982, and it was my pleasure to work and be inspired by you for the short period of time we overlapped in the sound departments at both the Elstree and then Nottingham Central Television studios. But it wasn't long before you moved from sound and became a trainee director. So what prompted that change in direction, as it were?
Well, when I talk to all my students and they're going off, I lecture occasionally at the University for the Creative Arts in the UK. And, they're all nervously going off trying to find their jobs and what they want to do. And even with my own children, I always say, declare what your end point is at the beginning. So don't kind of hide your light under a bushel. And so I always wanted to be a director. My father actually, although he died before I was born, was an art director, and he worked on big films like Moby Dick, Look Back in Anger, at Elstree, funnily enough, just across the road from where we were. I used to sit with my mum watching his films, and I'd have these storyboards and the scripts and all sorts of things in front of me. I'm dyslexic, and I've always had this very visual mind. So although I started in the sound department and sound was a passion of mine, I said at the very outset that my kind of end goal was to be a director. And, by hook or by crook, that came true.
Very good. Now, when we were corresponding before this recording, you said that you love TV as much today as you did on your first day. So I suppose a couple of questions occur to me to ask you. Now, in an industry known for burnout, how have you managed to keep that passion alive for over 40 years? And whilst I hesitate to say things were better years ago in our industry, I think it is fair to say that we joined a very different television production culture back then, didn't we? So my second question would be, how do you think it's changed and what heralded that change? For instance, can we blame Mrs. Thatcher for killing staff employment in the UK in the 1990s and creating an unprecedented rise in freelancers, which inevitably has led to the employment insecurity that we now all routinely face?
Well, look, luckily this isn't a visual podcast, so you talk about burnout, you'd see just how grey and gnarly I am now. But I still keep my passion for television and film and all visual arts very much alive. And I think really, if it's kind of in your DNA, it's in your DNA. You can't lose it or get rid of it. I love it. And partly because of the people. The thing that really impressed me on my very first day at Elstree, which I can remember as though it was yesterday, was just that wide spectrum of people with degrees from Oxford and Cambridge, people that had never seen the inside, well, they'd seen a few institutions, but not educational. And it was this wide spectrum of people all brought together with one goal, and that was to create something, to make something that other people would enjoy. And I think that's always been my perspective. And I've been lucky enough to work all over the world. So no matter where I go, I have this kind of scaffold of what our industry is and the people that make the show. And it's just building a different building within that scaffold with builders from different cultures. And I think really that's kind of what keeps my passion alive. With regard to the kind of whole change within the industry, Mrs. Thatcher, it was very funny, Mrs. Thatcher opened the Central Television Studios, or paid a visit, actually. It was Prince Charles that opened them, I think. Oh no, it's Duke of Edinburgh. But Mrs. Thatcher did pay a visit, and I was one of the chosen ones, which I think they all regretted, to kind of be like a lifestyle model in one of the control rooms doing grams. And the first thing that happened was this edict went out. We used to have 3 people in the gallery in those days. There'd be a sound director, a gram operator, and somebody else, often what I think now we'd call an intern, but somebody just kind of sucking it all in and getting the coffees. But it was decided that we couldn't have more than 2 people in any gallery. And before Mrs. Thatcher arrived, somebody came in and did a clean sweep and removed all the spare chairs. So it didn't look like there was a lot of sitting around. And that always amused me. The issue with the industry is not so much Mrs. Thatcher, although she did kind of blow a hole in our beloved ACTT union. But she did create the kind of freelance culture, which is now endemic. And also the kind of the slight, you have to be mindful of the budgets that you have and the money you have to spend on things. So I don't really sign up to accountants are the root of all evil. But she did change the way businesses look at each other and look at their modus operandi. But I think the thing that has changed the industry out of all recognition is the influence of the streamers and how they've impacted the way we work and created this terrible downturn of employment opportunity for freelance across the world. It's not just UK, it's same in Australia, same throughout Asia. And I think, that's the big shame.
I mean, you've written a lot recently. I've seen on social media posts about freelancing. What kind of opportunities, to look at it on a perhaps positive aspect, what kind of opportunities does the freelance market offer for people in the business? Like, what's the upside?
Yeah, look, there is an upside. And I think the upside is, content is everywhere and content needs people to service it, be that either from an editorial point of view or a technical point of view. And I think really it's, you have to have an open mind. And I think that's really what I try and advise people in the freelance market or going into the industry. When I started in TV, everybody wanted to be in broadcast. We all wanted to do those big shiny floor shows. And even if you move to satellite or cable, everybody tend to take, particularly in my country, a rather sniffy attitude to, you're in cable, are you? Or you're in satellite. Even children's, I loved working on children's programs. But people would say, because the kind of the front end of the ship was all about shiny floor and big entertainment or dramas or whatever else it happened to be. I think you have to lose that very quickly. And I think today, and I think you have to be prepared to be a podcast sound engineer, a sound recordist one day, a video recordist on a corporate video the next day, and perhaps a little bit of broadcast a day after that. And I think really we have to lose this kind of tiering of the various segments of our industry that we're so prone to do, and just think, I am an audio engineer and I am going to capture audio, and how that, or what platform that reaches, is kind of neither here nor there. And I think that's the only attitude you can have.
Mm-hmm. So as a director, you've led huge teams at the BBC and other networks, and smaller agile teams as a consultant. What are the key differences in your leadership style when managing 200 people versus a team of 10? And what are the key roles on a broadcast team that you would always aim to have just a single person responsible for?
The management structure, on something like Asia's Got Talent, we had a crew of 415 people from 4 different countries. They spoke 4 different languages, and there were probably 7 different meal plans, but also 4 or 5 different religious permutations with all of that, all of which one has to be very respectful and mindful of. Now, in a large team, the key thing is the structure, and the structure of who your lieutenants are. I don't want to use that military analogy too much, but who the people are who are leading each department and each team, and making sure that those appointments are key. In a smaller team, it's much more personal. You need to have very clear interpersonal skills. You might have one person who's like a second in command, who has your back and reinforces the things that you want to say and do. The same skills of leadership are required, but they're just used in slightly different ways. In a large team like Asia's Got Talent, you're probably directly leading 10 people. So it's not much different to just leading 10 people. But the key thing there is to make sure in a large group, everybody feels part of the system. You have, I always, in my kind of welcoming talk about an open door policy. It never gets used. People are too frightened to come into your office if they're very, very junior, and that's sad, but it's true. To have that sense of openness, to learn as many names as you can, and in my case, speak at least the pleasantries of as many of the languages of the people that are involved as possible.
Yeah. I think we get an overemphasis in this industry on the technical side of things, and forget that you have to have a talent with people, which is very evident that you must have. Can you think of a time where you helped a difficult team member or a struggling colleague to reach, their full potential? I
think one of the biggest challenges you face in a creative team is ownership of the creative idea. And I led the format development team as part of my role at the BBC. And it was always terribly difficult to get people who were contracted, they weren't necessarily staffers, to understand that the ideas they were having kind of belonged to the group. And of course, the natural tendency for creative people is to want ownership of those ideas. And that's terribly difficult to navigate in a large corporate space. And so there have been occasions where we've had to do the kind of, let's have a slight reality check here about, if your idea makes an impact on the BBC, that belongs to you and you alone. However, you might not make the same amount of return on that idea financially as you would do in the commercial world. But in the commercial world, it's much more difficult to get an idea that's an original in front of an audience. It comes down to knowing your people and knowing how to speak to them, and how to, this is the key thing, how people receive what you're saying. We put a lot of emphasis on understanding how we say things and how we use our own voices and our language. But the bottom line is, you can use perfectly good, reasonable language. And if somebody is not receiving that in the way you intended, it's down to you to change how you give them that information. And I think that's one of my, if you will, if somebody said, Jonathan, what is your key strength? I think understanding just that people always hear something different to what you possibly intended. And you have to be very aware of that and make sure people understand it. If you want a real specific, there was an incident, and I won't use any of the names, where a young researcher was accused of malpractice on a game show. And it was terribly difficult. And I had to suspend that young researcher while I investigated what was going on. And during that suspension, I couldn't obviously speak to the person. I could only look at the facts as they'd been presented and talk to the complainant and all of these kind of things. Anyway, then we sat down in my office to kind of finally bring the young person back in. And she brought a family solicitor with her because they clearly felt that this was a spurious accusation. And it was evident that this family solicitor was on the attack. And this was the first opportunity I had to actually talk to the young researcher and get their side of the story. And so I had to kind of say to the solicitor, look, I think you kind of misunderstood the process here. We did forward her the protocols beforehand of what should go on. But I said, I've not spoken to this young researcher. I want to find her point of view. Then there'll be a moment to retire and we can then move forward with some sort of plan of action. But until I've heard this person's side of the tale, I can't really decide on anything. But the point is that the solicitor had come into the office in a kind of totally defensive mood, and nothing I said could persuade her that I wasn't about to unjustly give this young researcher their marching orders out of the BBC. And that wasn't the case at all. And it was actually a very spurious accusation. But it kind of brought home that idea of it doesn't really matter how I say things, what the protocols are written on a piece of paper. If somebody isn't receiving the information that you're imparting in the way you intend, you have to modify the way that you are delivering that information.
And probably another area where that shows up, and this is kind of an aside, but you work outside the industry as a school governor. Do you think that your work in the voluntary sector in a community-focused role has influenced your approach to television production?
Yeah, very much so. And even to this current crisis within the industry around freelance employment. I'm part of lots of groups who are lobbying in some way, shape or form for change in the industry. And it's very easy to become partisan. It's very easy to sort of, look at the industry as the big bad wolf and that kind of thing. But in school governance, we have this very kind of binding principle of being a critical friend. And it's a phrase that I like, and I've been a school governor for probably 14, 15 years now. It's very important to me that you are able to say what you think is going wrong and it to be said and received in the spirit of positive friendship and not attacking, destroying the system. And that has become very evident during this freelance crisis, in that people are terribly defensive. People are all too ready to attack some of the institutions that have been put in place. And I think really, unless you can approach it as a critical friend and say, actually, do you know what, wouldn't it be better if, or how are you approaching your discussions with the employers, and ask those kind of questions rather than you're getting the discussions with the employers all wrong. They're walking all over. There's a way and a mean to the getting to the end of the road.
In going back to 1999, you were engaged as a consultant to the BBC, looking at production modernisation. And then between 2000 and 2002, you were appointed as the editor of BBC Light Entertainment and International Formats. That must have been quite a bit of a jump to make from the culture at ITV. What programme titles would we recognise from that period, and what was the BBC's brief to you?
Well, it was interesting. So prior to 1999, I was actually the producer of a show called The Generation Game. Now, it's probably well documented that the host of that show is quite a complicated character. And my strength has always been in dealing with difficult situations and dealing with them, and getting kind of positive outcomes without everybody kind of guns drawn in the car park. and that was also sort of the approach I had to take when I was modernising production. I had to go into the drama department and say to them, I just, for a second, ladies and gentlemen, want to look at your catering arrangements. I said, we all know, Neil, you go to the kind of craft table and there's kind of lobster at one end in those days, all the delights on that table of plenty. And I said, that's two other people's jobs that we're going to have to cut if you want to maintain that level of catering. So, you are going to have to think about modernising. You are going to have to think about that wonderful opening shot. You have to ask yourself that question, is that actually going to get any more people watching the programme? Or can we do an opening shot and a couple of scenes in that one day that you scheduled just for that opening crane shot? I appreciate it's difficult, but these are the kind of modernisations that we were having to look through. And of course, post-production was a key part of the whole modernisation thing. But yes, the difference between BBC and ITV was marked. And I love both institutions very much. I was brought up in ITV, and the BBC is very dear to my heart, because the one thing that really sets the BBC aside is that in that one place, Television Centre, there'd be kind of Walking with Dinosaurs would be down one end of the corridor, well, on a different floor. But the comedy department would be there with John Plowman and of all of his wonderful Ad Fabulous projects and all of those kind of thing. I was there sitting across things like The Weakest Link, Dog Eat Dog, National Lottery Jet Set, all of the big shiny kind of entertainment shows, Friends Like These, the whole slate of shows that Ian Wright did for the BBC. And it's kind of like almost like the University of Television. There's a department down the road, and we all did talk to each other. Walking with Dinosaurs would come to me and say, how do we reach a wider audience? We've kind of done dinosaurs. And I'd say, well, Tyrannosaurus rexes have babies. Why don't you tell that story? And they all went, what do you mean? And I said, well, we look at them all as terrifying things that eat us, but they have babies. Let's look at them as kind parents and kind of turn it on its head a little bit. These were the interactions that were so wonderful at the BBC and happened probably less so at ITV. And I think also that idea of the difference between public service television and commercial television is a DNA difference. It's in the culture of how those two large institutions work. And that's the kind of, if you like, the biggest jump that one has to make when going between the two companies.
Do you think that difference has blurred now? I mean, where do you think the BBC sits today, both culturally and commercially? I worked extensively on BBC programmes throughout the 1990s, and I find the BBC unrecognisable today from the organisation I spent a lot of time serving. What do you think has driven what seems like a radical political shift?
Money. Is the bottom line. The BBC is competing with commercial networks left, right and centre and streamers. The BBC has its licence fee, which is highly questionable in today's kind of climate. Not everybody chooses to watch the BBC. Why would they have to pay a licence fee? All of these kind of notions. But yes, I would agree now. It is unrecognisable. And I think, I'm a champion of the BBC and what it does. And I think it's important that we keep it on. But I would say the commercial pressures are the things that are changing the BBC, and the fact that that their licence fee hasn't kept pace with inflation. They're having to make cuts left and right, and it is unrecognisable. And the rigour that the number of people that work there were able to exact on a programme is being broken almost daily and tarnish the BBC's reputation. But it's again just down to the whole financial issues around trying to keep the show on air.
And do you think that that's, I mean, we can talk long into the night about eroding standards, as if we're a couple of old fossils, but I think it is the case that there are more instances of poorer standards that we're seeing reaching the screen. Do you agree with that?
Oh, completely. I kind of have to start calling it out. Now, Married at First Sight, let me just come clean about that. I have four women in the house who all enjoy watching it. And, sometimes I do come and sit in my study when it's on, but I can't lie and say I don't enjoy it. And I think it's a good family discussion, particularly with daughters, about how relationships work. I think the Australian version is streets ahead of the UK version in terms of its storytelling. And I don't mind saying that publicly. I also think, I watched the commitment ceremony of a British show 2 days ago. One of the cameras clearly had a back focus problem, and that never really seemed to get fixed. One of the experts said something that was clearly an audio drop-in over a shot of her smiling and not moving her lips. Also, there was a kind of mic placement problem down to probably the microphone disappearing in a cleavage that resulted in what can best be described as rather woolly audio. Now, these are things that should never make air. They never would have done when we were in charge. And I'm not saying that to kind of big up the system or big up our role in the system, Neil and Jason as well. It's just indicative of what people have to go through now. And I always used to say, I wanted a crawler caption across the bottom of some of my least successful work that said, this was recorded at 5 to 8. We were under an electrician's work to rule. We were going to have to finish at exactly 8 o'clock. We'd still got 10 minutes of material to record. It's a bit rushed. Sorry, it's not up to my usual standard. I think
I do remember those days in the gallery, actually. Yes, I do.
But I think that you look nowadays, and I'm sure there are people working on crews that said, we just had to do it. There was no time to readjust her microphone. That camera, we didn't notice. It had no disrespect to interns, but we had somebody who was fresh out of uni or whatever on the camera and didn't notice. These things happen when you're financially stretched. And so I'm not putting it down to lax standards. I think it's an interconnected system of issues.
I can actually remember seeing on a clapperboard, shot under protest.
Yeah.
I think just in that, it's ironic that the quality of the tools that we have now is so incredible, but at the same time, the budgets for making things, and especially the training and mentorship in, I hear both of you talking about the types of training and the long-form mentorship type work that went into getting into the industry when you started has changed so drastically that there's this crossover of we could be making the most amazing things ever, but we're not because people aren't trained, they don't have the time, they don't have the budgets, all these types of things.
Look, I think that's very true, Jason. I think, I just wanted to do a shout out to a person who I remember with great fondness, and that was a guy called Dave McNally, and he is an Australian, and he was unbelievably kind to me when I first started. I was one of the first, although I left university early to start, I was one of the first people to be taken from university into the ATV sound department and wasn't entirely welcomed with open arms by a lot of people. But Dave, who was salt of the earth, he wore a boiler suit, bib and braces, and he was a number 2 on a crew. He taught me so much in those first few days. Even just saying to me, Jonathan, if ever anybody asks you to get a microphone, make sure you've learnt the names of all the microphones in the sound store and get back first. I used to charge around like a lunatic just to make an impression and to show that I was prepared to work. That was a crew system. there was 6 crews at ATV, each with 5 to 6 people on them, working on programs day in, day out, different programs over the course of the year. And we'd do a sitcom one day, a kids program the next day, a big entertainment show at the weekend. The Muppet Show of all things kind of underpinned this. And there was no kind of greater centre of excellence and development of techniques within the industry than that. And we were all part of that at various levels. That kind of training, it is gold dust and just ceased to exist. It just doesn't happen anymore. And that's a tragedy. It really is. But we're in a system, we have to live with it. My plea would be allow people to train and allow people to train them.
You've created formats for wildly different cultures, from Suka Lattew in Malaysia to How Normal Are You in New Zealand. What's the first thing you do to understand what will resonate in a new market? Do you try to spend some time in a given culture to attune what speaks to them?
Oh, yeah, completely. It's one of the greatest privileges of my life to go and visit other cultures and be embedded in those cultures. I'm not a tourist when I go and work abroad. I'm part of the system. And I think you do have to understand the system. New Zealand is often mistakenly thought of as kind of England, and derogatorily, or in a derogatory way, people think of it as England, but sort of 30 years behind England, which is awful. It's a different culture. And the thing about television that never ceases to amaze me, particularly having met a lot of people that kind of work internationally, I know anything and everything that there is to know about British television because I've been watching it all my life. I know zero about television in New Zealand. And just because it's the same language, I can't say or pretend to understand that I know what New Zealand television is about. I haven't watched the classic series that people grew up with in New Zealand. I certainly haven't watched the classic series that people grew up with in Malaysia. So you have to you have an advantage to some extent in you look at it as a dispassionate observer. And so you're there and you're asking to understand it as opposed to just assuming that you understand it. But you have to understand who the people are, what makes them work, how their social structures work, and how different they are, particularly in all countries, to be honest. Part of that is understanding your own culture, understanding how the British class system works, however much we deny it works and it exists, it does, understanding our politics, understanding the peculiarities of our written media and newspapers, which is on the decline now, of course. These are all things that are very important. So yes, the short answer, or I know I've given you a long answer, but the short answer is you've got to understand the culture and spend some time understanding it.
And you've consulted with broadcasters like the CBC and NHK on their overall format strategy. What's the most common mistake or misconception you see when a broadcaster tries to develop or acquire a quote, hit format? And I suppose it rarely works to copy and paste a show format from one hemisphere to another.
No, that's very true. I think so. There's 2 classic mistakes. One is we're going to create a hit format. You almost can't do that. You should just create a good show and then look at that good show. You should have in the back of your mind kind of international travel. And I would say one thing, Jason, acquiring a format is very different to developing a format. It's easy to look at something like The Masked Singer and think, is that going to work for our market? What would we have to change to make it work? But to create a show like How Normal Are You, which was created for New Zealand, and think this is going to travel. You have in the back of your mind, how would it travel? How would it speak to another culture? How would we do it differently? And even something like Married at First Sight, is interesting because the dating cultures in all of our societies are so different. Clearly in Asia, the dating between young people is very different depending on what culture you come from. So there's all sorts of things that you kind of have to be mindful of.
And you mentioned show development and acquisition. You co-created Captive. Let me see if I got this right. You co-created it in the UK, and then it was acquired by a New Zealand company, production company. Is that how that works?
Yeah, yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, this is funny, you see. So it was a long time ago, and we co-developed it with a lovely guy two lovely guys, Matt Steiner and Simon Usiskin. And to be honest, it was their idea. We just put a few kind of, bells and whistles on it. But I'd completely forgotten that they were involved. And I wrote a post kind of claiming ownership of this thing, and suddenly realised, having looked back at my emails from, 25 years ago or whatever, that it was a co-production. So that was all a bit embarrassing. But yeah, so we developed it in the UK, and sadly it didn't ever make it. It was kind of the idea behind it was born out of the green room in a game show is a wonderful place, and we first introduced it on The Weakest Link as a kind of behind the scenes device, if you will. But on Captive, we decided that even after the game show part was one of where you had to gang up on the one of the people and kind of steal their money by either nominating them to ask a question they wouldn't be able to, or whatever it happened to be. But then, of course, you get into the green room afterwards, and normally people who have been forced out of the game show get in the first taxi home. They don't want to front up anybody in the green room. But we said, wouldn't it be fun if we locked the door? And they actually had to confront the issues that had been created on the show. And that was the basis of Captive. And of course, in the UK, it just wasn't of its time because Big Brother was just launching, and those sorts of shows were about. But in New Zealand, they have a show called Shortland Street, which is their kind of afternoon soap opera or early evening soap opera. And Shortland Street is a doctor's surgery, but it goes on hiatus for 5 weeks every year while everybody takes a break. And we pitched it to TVNZ. We pitched Captive as something that could go in that gap, and they said, okay, let's give it a try. And I knew the production company very well, Touchdown, run by Julie Christie. She loved the idea, and so we made the show. And of course, in terms of, you see, look, so Weakest Link, let me just talk about Weakest Link as a development project, because the Weakest Link came to be a success because to quote Emil Durkheim, the whole was more than sum of its parts, although that is often a misquote because I think it was Aristotle that came up with the original. But all the parts made it more than it really was. And Anne Robinson was key to that. This acerbic schoolmarm was part of what made that show a success. And I love Annie to bits, and she is a very funny person. But she's also very acerbic. Now, part of our format rollout was that the host should have that same feel in every country. And in Singapore, people aren't like that. People aren't upfront and unkind to each other. They don't criticise the way people look, certainly to their faces. And the point was kind of forced, and it kind of ran for about 8 episodes before it died a death because it was culturally inappropriate. So you have to be very aware of the cultural differences between countries before you even start. And something like Captive, I was sure that it would work in New Zealand because the culture is a little bit more upfront. And I won't say less polite, but it's sort of more upfront. It's more, as indeed it probably is in Australia a little bit. We're over polite in England. You get those wonderful memes where this is what was said and then this was what was really meant. I don't think that happens so much in places like Australia and New Zealand. I think people are much more honest about the way they feel about things, although I'm prepared for a flood of people that live in both countries to tell me that I'm talking rubbish. But, there are differences.
Can we talk about Gladiators? Winning a Royal Television Society Craft Award for Best Multi-Camera Work that's a huge deal for a director. Can you walk us through the biggest technical or logistical challenge of directing a live show of that scale, Jonathan?
Yes, I can. Look, I inherited that show. Steve Smith, who's a great director, had done the first 2 series. And, I was brought in after then. And the question was, what can I bring to it? What can I do to it? And I kind of looked at the way it had been done and thought, we're treating this too much like an entertainment show and not like an event. And to the point where before every interview after a game, makeup and wardrobe would go in and wipe the sweat off people. And I said to Kenny, who was producing, I think that's madness. I said, I want to see how difficult it is. I don't want people to think it's a light touch. Both the Gladiators and the Contenders come in out of breath, hot, sweaty. Some of them can't even speak. Let's capture that. Let's not get makeup and wardrobe in. Let's make it immediate. Let's make it in front of our very own eyes. We'll run the cameras in handheld after every event, get the presenters in and talk to them while they're still breathless. And so that was my kind of main, if you will, contribution to the show. But then, of course, that creates 101 logistical problems of the culture that had gone before me under Steve was a little more, not relaxed at all, but measured, I would say, and people found their positions. So there were lots of arguments about shadows because maybe we weren't in the optimal position because of my running in. So that was slightly changing the culture. That was a little bit difficult. The sheer number of people that you have to work with and the clarity of your communication is a skill that I'm grateful to have learnt on shows like Gladiators, because I did a show for the Army, which was one of the very first, it was for ITV, but it was about the Army. We all had open talkback, and it was the first multi-camera Betacam shoot that had ever really been attempted. So we had 6 units with wonderful jam sync time code, which often went awry. But anyway, that's another story. But they'd be operating within a 2-mile footprint, and we'd all have talkback. And it was very funny because the Army beforehand, they wanted a complete hierarchy. I was the second director. Den Liddington was the main director. The Army would only talk to Dennis or to the producer. They wouldn't talk to me because I was way too down the ranks to even be spoken to. That soon changed. The Army came up to me afterwards and said, Jonathan, the thing that has astounded us all is your talkback discipline. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, your crew, you don't say Roger over and out. You don't have call signs. But everybody speaks when they're spoken to. Everybody knows who is being spoken to. You have such an easy talkback protocol. And the colonel said to me, how long does it take for people to learn that? And I said, well, there's not a lesson. I said, they just listen and follow suit, and woe betide anybody that doesn't. And they would get taken aside by their senior and said, hey, just wait until your name's called before you start leaping on. Multi-camera work, it's about comms. And the biggest technical issue is, to be honest, this is going to sound really ridiculous, it's making sure everybody's ready. That idea, it doesn't happen in Asia at all, of, okay, everybody, we're going in 5. For nowadays, people just fall into action, and then one of the cameras might be talking to the makeup girl, or whatever else it happens to be. And they don't realise until they see it all kicking off that they've got to pick the camera up and get some shots. This is the main thing. It's working as a team and working collectively. That is the biggest challenge on those huge multi-camera things, particularly live gigs. I did a Dua Lipa concert with an Indonesian crew in Jakarta. And It was tough because not everybody could hear me. We were directing partly in Bahasa, partly in English. It's difficult, and comms is the biggest challenge, and camera shadows.
I call live shows for a venue here in Sydney. This is my side gig, and I find it difficult enough to call 6 PTZs and 3 live cameras. I can't imagine what it's like on one of these gigantic productions that you're on.
Yeah. You get over To be honest, you get over 10 cameras, and that's where the problems start. In fact, 8 it is, because often the vision switcher's only got 8 fingers. They might employ a thumb and sort of get it up to 9. But the moment you get up to kind of camera 26, and the vision switcher has to take their eye off the screens, find 26 with their right hand, that's where you start getting into problems.
You were the executive producer and director of The Chair with John McEnroe. What was it like directing a personality as famously strong-willed as McEnroe? Did he live up to his reputation?
Completely. I mean, look, there's 2 things about that. It was one of the joys of my career is that, I get those 2 credits: exec producer. I was the head of BBC Light Entertainment at the time, and I also directed it. And it wasn't me kind of getting my elbows out and saying, I'm going to direct this. Susie Lamb, who is one of the most talented producers in the country and is now head of studio at BBC. But Susie was the producer, and she asked me to direct it, knowing that John could be complicated. And he was kind of what I would call beautifully complicated. So the show originated in New Zealand and was developed by Julie Christie at Touchdown Television. I bought it for the BBC based on the American version, where they did things like drop alligators out of the ceiling. And the whole point of The Chair is you sit in a chair, you have your resting heart rate measured, and if you go above your resting heart rate, the money you've won starts to tick away until you bring your heart rate back down again. So it's that fear of the question and also jump scares as we went through the show. I went over to Los Angeles for 24 hours to sign John for the BBC version. And I went over, Julie was there producing away, and she said, "Hey, John McEnroe, this is Jonathan Glazier. He's come over to sign you up for the BBC." And John said, "Hey, Jonathan, how long are you here for?" And I said, 24 hours. He went, "What?" I said, "Well, I've come over specially." I said, "I'm not going home without your signature on this contract." And I became his best friend, because it was like, Jonathan, he's come over for 24 hours just to see me, and all of this kind of malarkey was going on. Anyhow, how that changed. He came over to do our show. I want to make it quite clear. I love John. He's fantastic. But he made me promise that the heart monitor would never fail. And I said, "John, we will do everything we possibly can to super glue the heart monitors onto our contestants." I said, "However, if we get somebody who's a profuse perspirer and it just slips, it's just one of those things. We just have to deal with it when we go." Anyway, because they were having failures. Maybe this is a comment on the size of Americans' meals, but anyway, they had a profusity of failures of the heart monitor in America, which drove him around the twist. In the UK, I think we managed about 5 record days until one failed, and of course that one failing tipped John over the edge to the point where he left the studio, and I had to go and calm him down in the dressing room, which I like doing. That's one of the bonuses of my job. But John would be that wonderful mixture of sort of quite grumpy and then phoning me up. His family was over and saying, "Jonathan, where can my wife take the family today?" And so on the way into work, I'd be giving him directions to London Zoo and hoping that the family would enjoy it. And then at work, he'd be giving me grief. And then he'd be my best friend, phoning me up afterwards and saying, "The family had a great time at London Zoo, Jonathan. Thank you for that." So it was a little bit difficult to navigate, but it was good fun.
Well, in complete contrast, I suspect, you were the series director for ITV's This Morning in the mid-1990s, which remains somewhat of a UK TV institution. What can you tell us about the unique pressure of directing a live daily show where anything can happen compared to a pre-recorded series?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's 2 challenges about that. So Richard and Judy are a married couple. They come as a team. And sometimes that can be difficult to navigate for the producers and the director, in that they might have cooked up some slant on something in the car on the way into work. And then, of course, we have to either unpick that or just straight go with it when they actually get to the studio. So, they had their moments. And I got on very well with both of them. But my favourite issue on This Morning, we had a guy from Blue Peter, God, his name escapes me, Peter Duncan, who was starring in Barnum, the show about the circus man. And he was actually doing a trapeze act as part of his performance in the show. So on the dock, we'd set up his trapeze. He would do some trapeze work. Richard and Judy, during the ITN news at 12 o'clock, would drive to this particular part of the dock and interview Peter about his performance in Barnum. Fine. And so we come to do it. We finish in the studio. I say, okay, Richard and Judy relocate to the Barnum set. They go out, they get in their car, and they're driving to where Barnum happened, which is a good, as the crow flies, probably 500 metres, the way the car had to go by, twisty and turny and all the rest of it. Anyway, we came back off ITN. I'm now directing Peter Duncan flying through the air. Floor manager comes on. Jonathan, Richard and Judy aren't here yet. Tell Peter to keep going. Richard and Judy had got lost. And Peter Duncan, instead of doing 2 minutes, had to do about 5 or 6. And by the time Richard and Judy got there, the poor guy almost needed an ambulance and a hospital treatment. There was no interview. And we kind of had to roll the end credits. Anyway, anything can happen when you're live.
You started at Elstree in 1979 in sound, but now your CV lists coding in JavaScript and HTML and CSS. How essential is it for today's producers to have a hands-on technical understanding of these types of things? And how did your background in sound inform your subsequent career in this?
Well, look, so hands up, my kind of education was all about maths, physics. I was actually doing nuclear physics at university when I decided to leave and go into television. So the kind of, and I've always been an absolute computer nerd. So the programming of Python and my subsequent kind of forays into AI are all personal interest, but with a kind of grounding. Do producers need to know? No, I don't think they do. I think producers need to be good storytellers. Do directors need to know any of the technical stuff? But my argument would be, you can't make a beautiful coffee table out of wood without knowing what chisels, planes and lathes do. So you do need an understanding of the tools and the what's available to craft your end product, whether you need to be able to be an expert in them, or you just need to be able to tell the person operating the chisel how to make the legs of the table or whatever else it happens to be. And I often use that thing of, I might not be Michelangelo, but like the Pope of the time, I gave Michelangelo the environment to paint the Sistine Chapel. And I think that's really what good directors and producers do. We create a special team, an environment, and a culture where people can do their best creative work and be recognised for doing that creative work. So I wouldn't say you have to. I'm glad I have, because I think it is an advantage.
Have you ever had the opportunity where someone says, well, it doesn't really take a nuclear physicist to do your kind of work, and you say, well, actually.
Oh dear, sadly not, but I one day.
I noted on your website that you've used or you've advised on the use of QPilot to automate shows. And I shot call and switch for a decently large venue here in Sydney every week for live shows, and they often involve only brief rehearsals with the performers and my camera operators. How does an automation system like QPilot streamline a show call on the day? And I suppose, can it be overused or actually diminish the roles of experienced professionals in the moment who are on their game to start with?
Well, look, I had a massive argument with, it wasn't actually QPilot, it was... QPilot was developed for the Eurovision Song Contest, which is a complicated show where, 14, 15, 19 different countries come together, and they're all extremely particular about how their artist is shot. And it has to be repeatable from the rehearsal, and it has to follow their direction or their creative brief, if you will. And you can't have something go wrong. So QPilot was developed to give you easily repeatable switching between cameras. And it achieves that very, very well. But I had an argument with this, I think it's called Edit Live, because the Eurovision of 2 years ago was so overcut, it was unwatchable. It was like, we're going to do everything on a kind of 14 frame cut. And it was just like watching a strobe light for an hour and a half. It was absolutely dreadful. And that is the problem with QPilot. There's no light and shade if it's not used properly. And the beauty of what a good director does is that light and shade. If something needs to have an injection of incitement, or the music is gives you that feel, by all means cut away. But if it's a beautiful ballad, overcutting it can ruin it as much as anything else. So and also, the shots get kind of too tricksy. I still don't know what the set looked like from 2 years ago on Eurovision, because every shot was on the move. There was no establishing wide shot. All those boring things that we learn about, let's see the geography, go in for the coast, all of that kind of stuff was gone in this blur of cutting. On the day, I wished we'd had QPilot when I used to do Stars in the Rise. Stars in the Rise, we rehearsed it all in a day. We did have a kind of a day with stand-ins, which is almost no use to man nor beast. But the point about it was that it was a competitive environment. You had to be fair to everybody. And in front of the audience, everybody got to sing their song twice. And if we messed it up on first one, or there was a technical fault, there was always... And everybody did it. Even if the first one was perfect and beautiful, we'd do it again so that nobody could turn around afterwards, another contestants, and say, they did it once, I got to do it twice, or whatever. It was fair. But to have QPilot on that to take out one of the variables would be great. And the way it would have been used, I would probably camera script it at home, put it on the computer, we'd rehearse it once, we'd alter the shots, and it would be there, repeatable on the performance on the evening. Or the other way you can use it is you can actually record the dress and have it play back, as it were, but with a new performance in front of your very eyes. Or you can play, you can program it as you go during the rehearsals, and then slip any shots or change any shots on the timeline if you want to do that. So, it's a great piece of kit. Where it falls down slightly, they wanted to use it on the National Day Parade in Singapore. It's a military precision entertainment, and it is timed to the second. It might work, but where it doesn't work is where suddenly something is different, or you want to go slightly off-piste. Yes, you can, and you can hop back into it. Just like on a camera scripted piece, you can say off script, as directed, coming back to script with shot 14 and take 14 on 2. You can do that kind of stuff. You can do a similar thing with QPilot. I think QPilot is great, and it's a tool that can be used and should be used, but it also has its limitations. You wouldn't use it on This Morning, a live daytime show. It'd be a waste of time and money.
I'd completely forgotten about Stars in Their Eyes there, Jonathan. Guy Littlemore and I, with a camera and sound team that would go round. This was in the days of Leslie Crowther being the presenter, and we would do the background stories to the contestants. So that was great fun. We really enjoyed that. Now, your work in Saudi Arabia, setting up studio operations focused on live streaming. Where do you see the biggest opportunity for traditional broadcasters in the live streaming and digital content space?
So we ask ourselves, what is live streaming really? All it is just taking the output of the Vision Mixer and sticking it on the internet. And I think, certainly in sport, we're going to see, or we are seeing, much more of that. I think we're seeing many more, if you will, niche channels coming through in that kind of whole live streaming mode. And if you're talking about using, PTZ's streaming, we're streaming radio cams, we're using IP protocols instead of those bloody awful BNCs. it's already there. And I think really it's just how the broadcasters are going to monetize it. The streamers are already obviously using it. It's just another delivery method, isn't it really, Neil, of how we get our captured images to an audience.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to something that we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is the quality of the service that's provided. Now, you've been a judge at the Rose d'Or and at the Monte Carlo festivals. What qualities make an award-winning show today? Has the definition of quality seriously changed since you started?
Gosh, no, that's a good question. I think the others have been as well. What's changed? The way we deliver content is now informed by the internet. When I first started in broadcasting, the broadcasters, both in terms of storytelling and content and technical standards, informed everything else. And, everybody kind of tried to emulate broadcast and all the rest of it. I think nowadays, with jump cut editing, white flashes, we're seeing that the internet and the way we're educating our audience and YouTube and what have you is slightly more informing the way people view content. The main principle of all judging, and I've just judged the Content Asia Awards, but the main thing is it entertaining? Does it hold me? Is it engaging? What's the storytelling? And storytelling is everything in every platform, on every platform, in everything we do. And it's the quality of the storytelling and how we use our technology to tell those stories. You look at Adolescent and their kind of one-take scenes or episodes for that wonderful series. That technique added something incredible to the storytelling. In the same way that when 24 was first Kiefer Sutherland spy thing, where we saw a 24-hour period with those wonderful kind of split screens to go between one thread of the 24 hours and another thread of the 24 hours. It kind of added to that urgency and that immediacy. And this is happening here and now. This is live. Whoa, this is, it helped tell an exciting story. And I think really that's it. Podcasting, I think, is great because it's like slow TV. These wonderful podcasts now where you get people having a conversation. It's the opposite of that. It's like we can stream it live. We can even put it on an auto cut. It doesn't matter if the cut is just slightly behind while the technology picks up on who's speaking. It's a piece of slow television where what you're listening to are the words and what's being said. And the kind of visuals is just, an embellishment. And I think a good program is about storytelling and engagement.
Interesting. I mean, Jason and I, Jonathan, have made the very conscious decision that we would stay audio only with this.
Yeah.
And we had reasons behind that, didn't we, Jason?
Yeah, and I think it does come down to we don't want to do those jittery cuts and, all this sort of standard YouTube stuff. We want to actually craft it into a nicely finished product. I think it was my main thing.
No, I think that's a good choice, because, I listen to podcasts in the car, so I can't be watching a video. I listen to podcasts while I'm walking the dog. I'll bump into trees if I'm watching my iPhone. So, and I think it's great that podcasting has reintroduced an audience to the beauty and purity of radio and how what's being said, again, it's about the story. And if the person who's speaking is engaging and interesting, who needs a picture of them just flapping their mouths about?
Yeah. Just still on training, for an aspiring creator today, what's the single best piece of advice you'd give them for building a career? And like, as I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of live event work on the side. And I'm mostly on vision, either switching or camera operating. But I'm noting that most of the, and I can say this now that I've passed 50, most of the young people coming into the industry are studiously making sure they have crew time on vision and sound and systems, networking and lighting and everything. It seems like they're aware that they'll likely need to be a complete all-rounder rather than a specialist.
Yeah, look, I think absolutely. I was reading something yesterday about that notion of, we started off with producers and directors, then we got PDs, then we've got the predators and all that kind of stuff. I think you do have to be an all-rounder. I think that's very important. And I think actually, to be honest, even if you're a specialist, I had, as a sound person, I loved learning all about lighting, which of course we had to avoid boom shadows. And I think if you're into TV, the language that all the different departments use is a good point of study and a good point of reference, because as we've already established, it's an industry about communication. And look, I don't want to sound like a 66-year-old, but the one other thing that has been denied a cohort of children because of COVID and social media is that face-to-face interaction. And I think the one thing that our industry feeds off is a group of people making something together. Just that little look over an eyepiece to the sound person to tell them that they're just on the edge of shot and without a conversation. Just those little bits of body language where you can understand that maybe your presenter or your host is feeling a huge amount of pressure from being on camera and needs a little bit of TLC. These are all things that a younger generation haven't really learnt because they're buried in their phones. They're buried in the electronic culture that we've kind of developed of isolation. My two pieces of advice were: learn the business from the inside out. Don't just focus on one discipline. And also just think and be mindful about how you interact with the people around you, and interact with them. Ask some questions. Don't be embarrassed. Have some confidence. Even if that confidence hides the biggest insecurities in the world, have some confidence.
Jonathan, I think both you and I are similarly minded, by which I mean that we've both been outspoken and critical of the training that both industry newcomers and developing professionals can expect to receive today, and also the working conditions that they're likely to be subjected to, certainly compared to the industry that we joined as trainees. And as I said earlier, I really don't mean to wear rose-tinted glasses or to promote the ideas of the good old days or that was a golden era. But where do you think the responsibility lies for the skill shortage that the British film and television industry has faced over, well, at least the last 2 decades? At a time when each year record numbers of hopefuls are enrolling in university media training courses, they're taking on huge debt to fund their own training, but come out at the other end of their degrees ill-prepared for the workplace. What do you think could be a better way forward?
So, this is my take on it. The education industry has been hijacked by commercial enterprise. So nowadays, particularly in my country, we have a huge reliance on students coming from abroad to help offset the lack of funding that universities have. And it creates this kind of, who cares about the course, just get some students on it. And the training they receive is often lamentable, particularly in the media. And I think it's very true. You look at the media curriculum at GCSE and A-level, it's not fit for purpose. And so the education system is partly to blame. Then, of course, you've got the industry. Under financial pressures, the first thing to go is training. The wonderful institutions that we do have, skill set and all the rest of it, screen skills, do their best to provide some degree of personal development for people in the industry and for newcomers. But the point is, it's all fractured and it's all built around money. It shouldn't be about money coming in. It should be about what we're producing going out. Now, the National Film and Television School in the UK produce a report every 5 years where they really drill down into what they're doing and who they are producing. 22 people on the set of Wicked were graduates of the National Film and Television School. 87% of people working in the television industry, newcomers working in television, 80% of their cohort get jobs in professional film and television. These are levels unheard of at other courses around the country, with a few notable exceptions, like Exeter and Bournemouth and some of the more specialist colleges. But media has also been hijacked by an affordability belt, and that is only people from well-supported backgrounds can afford to join the media, because the level of employment is so weak that you have to rely on somebody to bail you out every 6 months while you're waiting for the next contract to come along. Whereas if people had downtime at ATV when I first started, they'd do a bit of training. They'd do some edit training. Somebody from one of the crews that could be spared would take them into a gallery and show them how to plug up a monitor mix. That just doesn't happen anymore. The system has really broken when it comes to training and education. And I think that can be seen by the standards that are reaching the screen. And I think we ask the wrong people what to do about it. And I think the people who are working in pure education need to ask the industry what it requires. I think people working in education at a much more early level, GCSE and A-level, need to look way into the crystal ball and see that visual effects and virtual backgrounds are really one of the least served areas of our industry in terms of training and development. And that means people need to learn about 3D environments, about computer programming, and about how that can be used as a creative tool. The computer games industry has done better than we have at training people. The television industry has really failed, I think.
Now, you said you're home for a bit of a respite right now, but you often spend 6 months of each year working away from the UK. How has this digital nomad lifestyle impacted your family, and how do you maintain a balance in all that?
Yeah, clearly. I mean, obviously, between Rebecca and I, there has to be 100% trust. That's the first thing to say. People who are in a marriage that has got a few holes in it, shall we say, you shouldn't attempt to do what I do. It'll go pear-shaped very, very quickly. I couldn't do it without modern technology. If I couldn't FaceTime the kids, I wouldn't be able to survive. We forget as well. We look at it as a little bit of a kind of, I don't know, a kind of first world problem of suddenly people having to work away from home. But if you look at the Philippines in particular, and you look at other cultures around the world, Afghanistan, migrant workers are part of the culture. It's part of the way people support their families. And I think as we head far more towards portfolio careers, which is going to happen as we move far more to international careers, which is also going to happen, and going where to work with, is people have to work out how they navigate their interpersonal relationships.
So, final question. If you could go back in time and give one piece of advice to your 25-year-old self, just starting out at ATV, what would it be?
Contribute to a private pension. I think everybody should do that, and I think they should do it from almost the moment they leave the womb. But no, so yes, apart from that, the price of a cappuccino a week is going to see you live a long and happy life in retirement. I just wish I'd done that. Anyway, but apart from that, I think the one piece of advice I would give myself is believe in yourself a little bit more. I talked a little bit about it, and I often come across as, and one would think as a director, you're a very confident person speaking to a lot of people, public speaking, doing things like this, whatever else it happens to be. That kid inside of me is still slightly nervous about what he's doing, suffers from imposter syndrome, all of those things. And it's only when you reach the ripe old age of whatever it is, and you suddenly think, all that time worrying about who I was and what I was and whether I was doing it right, I wished I'd just got on and done it. And I think that would be what I would say. I'd give myself a little pat on the back and say, you're allowed to make mistakes. You're allowed to get it wrong. Nobody's going to hate you. Nobody's going to take you out the back and put a sack over your head and take you off in a taxi. You're going to be fine. Just carry on. Well, I'm going to give you a pat on the back and say, thank you so much for being that inspiration to me when I very first joined the industry, because you were, a few years in front of me. So I looked
to you when I joined Elstree, and I thought, if I can turn out half as good as this chap, then I won't be doing too bad. And you continue to be an inspiration to me as well with the way that you've had such an exciting career, Jonathan. It's been very exciting to watch your meteoric rise. And a sustained rise as well. So, just out of interest,
Neil, can I just say one thing? Just one thing that I kind of wanted to say, and that is the one thing that is missing from the kind of equation at the moment is mentorship and leadership. And you've been very kind to say those things about me. All I want is I can't pay back Steve Turner for helping me become the director that I am. I can't pay back Ray Butt for helping me understand comedy as I do, or John Scofield, or all the thousands of people that I looked up to while I was starting out. The only way I can do it is pay forward. And I'm denied the opportunity because of the way training works, to pay forward all those new entrants into the industry. And I think the industry and the education system should look to people, not people like me, but people who have the experience to train, to do that training, and pay forward what they were given by training up a new cohort of excellent television content creators and video practitioners.
Well, Jonathan, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today on the show. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Just out of interest, where are you off to next?
Next, I think, and I hope, I am going to Bhutan. I've got a couple of shows in the pipeline there. So that'll be a place I've not been to before, so very much looking forward to that.
Well, we wish you all the very best for your continued success, home and abroad. Jonathan's contact details are available on today's show page, along with contact details for Jason and me as experienced and enthusiastic dialogue editors for hire, my work as a sound producer helping ambitious filmmakers by acting as a consultant and overseeing their film soundtracks from pre-production right through to post-production, as well as a link to the live online coaching sessions and workshops that we run on sound design and DaVinci Resolve, which we like to think of as relevant and useful for all craft creatives, such as directors and picture editors, and not just sound professionals.
It's our goal with this podcast series to educate listeners from all backgrounds about the underappreciated, wider role that sound plays in life as well as in the film and television industry, and also to develop a sound language and style of dialogue that filmmakers can use to more easily communicate with each other about sound for moving pictures. If you like what you've heard today, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave comments about what would be helpful to you and your work, and who you'd like to hear from on the show. And lastly, as ever, thanks for listening.
The Apple and Biscuit Show is written, produced and presented by Jason Nicholas and Dr. Neil Hillman. It is edited and mixed by Jason Nicholas in our Sydney studio.
Apple and Biscuit Show.